Hello, everybody. My name is Marnie, and I'd like to welcome you to Frankston City Library's FrankTALK with Australian Children's Laureate for 2020-2021, Ursula Dubosarsky. Before we get started, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which Frankston City Libraries operates, the Bunurong people of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and future. I'd also like to extend that acknowledgement to the elders of any other communities who may be joining us today. Now, Ursula Dubosarsky is widely regarded as one of the most talented and original writers in Australia today. She is the author of many outstanding books, both for young adults and for children, and has won several national literary awards. And as I said before, is the Australian Children's Laureate for 2020-2021. She believes that every child needs their own library card to unlock thousands of books so they can read for their life. Ursula's new book, Pierre's Not There, is about a girl who transforms into a dog, a boy on a quest, and a magic puppet show with the power to change lives. Ursula, thank you so much for joining us today.
Total pleasure. I couldn't, it's just delightful. So thank you everybody for tuning in. So I'm really looking forward to having a great discussion and lots of questions or comments.
Absolutely. Now tell me, what compelled you to write Pierre's Not There?
Well, look, it's about a sort of magic puppet theatre, and certainly, like all children, I think, I was a great one for making puppet shows, sort of, hiding behind the sofa with your toys and putting on shows for your families. As I grew a little older, it became a little bit more elaborate, and we painted scenery and actually made puppets out of paper mache, and I even wrote little songs and went the whole way, and charged 5 cents for my parents to get in. And in those days, because I'm quite old, you used to have to stand up for the national anthem at the theatre before the show went on. So I even used to play the national anthem on my recorder and make them stand up. So I loved the whole theatre of the theatre, I guess. And I guess I just always found it, I don't know, it's funny, isn't it? The most exciting part for me, the cinema, the theatre, anything, is that moment when the lights go down and it's about to start. For me, that was always, I guess it's that threshold moment of some sort of intense creativity. And what happened was I'd always had a kind of idea I'd like to write about a puppet show. But writers in the audience will know this, that, you have an idea, but at some strange moment in your life, the idea comes to life. It's been bubbling there in the back, but you somehow the moment doesn't arrive to write it. And what happened with this book, there are a couple of things. First thing was, a friend of mine told me, and this is sort of how the book begins, that when she was a little girl, her mother used to clean houses, and in the school holidays, she would go with her mother while cleaning houses. And, some of these houses her mother used to clean were sort of big, lavish houses on the edge of the harbour. And she would go and there'd be nobody home. And her mother would say to her, well, you go off and don't touch anything. And I'll do my work and don't bother me. And so she would almost she could just sort of wander around the house looking. And so that just struck me as a fantastic opening of a children's story somehow, those sort of moments where the child is in a sort of mysterious different place where sort of anything could happen. So I had that idea as a beginning, and I don't know why I connected it with the idea of a puppet theatre, but the actual, as the doctors say, the precipitating event was about 5 years ago now. And I was in Paris. I was there for 6 months on a sort of writing thing, and it was getting towards the end of the 6 months, and we realized we hadn't been to see Versailles, the big palace just outside Paris. And I'm actually not a great one for palaces. I find them a bit overwhelming, all that kind of stuff. But anyway, I thought, I've got to see Versailles. So we went out on the train to Versailles, and we looked at the palace, and of course we wanted to go to the sort of place that I'm sure you've heard of, where Marie Antoinette sort of made a kind of pretend farm, and with little, I don't think they were fake cows, but, like it was a pretend farm where she could pretend to be a milkmaid. And I had read somewhere that she'd also made a sort of, not exactly a pretend theatre, but a very small theatre, sort of based on one of the theatres in Paris, where she would and her friends would, you know, put on plays for each other in the evenings. And we couldn't find it. You know, we're walking for miles and miles and miles, and I was sort of getting quite irritated and exhausted. But, you know, when you're determined to find something, I wasn't going to give up. And anyway, in the end, and nobody seemed to know where it was, and there were no signposts. And in the end, my husband sort of put it on the GPS of his phone, and he said, well, that's it. And there was this building that didn't look particularly exciting, but it did say on the phone that this was the Queen's Theatre. And it was all locked up. Now, I'm not normally like this, right? I'm a very law-abiding person, but I was like, and I saw at the back of this building, there was an open door. And I thought, let's go in, come on. And so we went in through the back door, and it was all dark, and there was a little sort of rickety stairway. And I said, let's go up there. So we went up the stairway, and then it was not completely dark, but very dark. And I just kept walking forward. And I realized as I was walking forward, there's actually an illustration in the book that is more or less what happened. As I was walking forward, it's this illustration here, I became aware that on either side of me was all this sort of painted scenery and on wheels. So obviously to sort of be wheeled out for the various backdrops. And I just kept walking forward. And I have to say, this might say something about my life, but it was like the most exciting. I've never been so excited in my entire life. Let's put it that way. I was just like in this frenzy of excitement. It was like you'd stepped into somebody's unconscious mind or something. And we just kept walking forward. And then we heard this voice, quite nervous, startled voice saying, who's there, in French. And I should add at this point that all of Paris was in a state of anxiety and startlement at that time, because it was probably just about 2 weeks after the attacks on the Bataclan and the surrounding cafes, which was a terrible, terrible time. So there were, you know, the whole place was in a state of high alert. And so then the lights came on, and in front of us, we realized we were standing in the middle of the stage. And in front of us was this sort of bank of red velvet, golden, sort of palatial looking seats. And this poor sort of young man appeared from the shadows and said, what are you doing here? And, you know, I explained pathetically, just having a look or something. And he very, you know, nicely said, well, time to go. It's locked. Please leave. And really, as I say, I was just in this, I felt like I'd had the most exciting experience of my life. And I guess that was the moment where I kind of felt, you know, I hadn't become a puppet, but it was, I suppose, that feeling. What happens in this book is when she starts, there's a little boy upstairs there's meant to be nobody in the house, but there's a little boy, and he's got this magic looking, or this very beautiful looking puppet theatre. And he's also got a box of puppets. And his problem is he keeps getting stuck in the story. He needs someone to help him in a way so they can make a story together for it to continue. And so they start playing with the puppets. And that's, I suppose, then she realizes that she's almost become a puppet. She picks a wolf puppet or a dog, and she realizes that instead of, she's sort of standing up and the scenery is as large as her, and she's actually, she then realizes she's become a puppet. And that's when in the play, in the book, I should say, the curtain rises and the book turns into a puppet play. It's written as a puppet play rather than as straight prose. And it's only when they kind of leave the puppet show towards the end that the book returns to regular prose. Sorry, that's a very long explanation, but I guess that's the sort of the two important things that kind of helped me to write it, or made me want to write it. I guess I had to do, all the writers and readers here will know, when you're in a state of excitement about something, you have to do something with it. And that's what I sort of did. Eventually, a few years later, like I took my time, but yeah.
I think what I love about your explanation then is in your notes at the back of the book, you do talk about that experience of going into the theatre. But in the
Yes.
notes, it's like, oh, we saw a door open and we just thought we might go and see what was beyond it. Whereas here, you're like, I knew that door was open and I knew what was going to be in there. So I went in regardless because I wanted to check it out. Like, I love that.
Obviously, I toned it down in the note at the back. Perhaps I didn't want to see
happened
like
to go
some
through this
sort
door.
of maniac. I was a maniac. You know, when you get to that point where you just,
I love it.
Well,
I could imagine your husband. I could imagine your husband being there going, no, come on, we're not meant to be.
Look, he was, in a sense, he just gave in. Yeah, he certainly, because he wasn't that interested himself, if you know what I mean. But however, he could have just stayed outside. So he followed me in.
I absolutely love it. Now, I did like the way it went into, I guess, a screenplay, really.
Yes.
It became a play. And I was reading it aloud to my 6-year-old. Obviously, the writing itself is a little bit advanced for her. She's just turned 6 last weekend. But there were times that I was getting so into character, I think because of the pace of your writing, I was getting so into character that I turned around at one point and her shoulders were up like this. And I thought she was about to burst into tears because there is a scene where they're going through a forest and she's like, and I said, oh, are you all right? And she went, oh, yeah. But she was getting so into your prose that she was in the story. So I am curious to know what inspired you to go from book writing and then swap into the play itself.
Look, it's as you were describing that and about the pace and your beautiful little daughter, who I hope isn't traumatized, does have a happy ending.
She loved the book, loved it.
But look, it's interesting because I feel as if when I first thought of writing a book about a puppet show, possibly 30 years ago, like just as a result of loving puppets as a child, I feel as if it had always been in the back of my mind that I might write part of it as a play. But when I actually sat down to write it, that idea had disappeared. And I was going to write it all as prose. And I was fine with the bits right up until when the puppet show begins. I was sort of confidently writing and enjoying the writing and all of that. And then when I started writing the puppet show itself in prose, it was so sort of dead on the page. It was sort of dreary. It was very cliched. It was kind of, it just felt bad. You know, when you're writing something that's not good, you just sort of know it. And I sort of struggled on and it was just not good. And I'm not quite sure how the memory came back to me that I had thought I should write it as a puppet play. And as soon as I started writing it like that, as you say, the pace, it just sort of, you know, flew ahead in a very natural way. So it's kind of interesting, isn't it, that a puppet play is not made for prose. You know, it's not the right fit. It's sort of, when I was having to describe the boring old scenery, do you know what I mean? Like, it was just like, God, who's going to read this? You know, it was just this feeling of being weighed down. And it's so interesting to think how certain types of storytelling have their form. And a puppet play needs to be in the form of a puppet play. Otherwise, it just seems very stilted or something. So, look, I have to admit, of all the types of writing I've ever done over my life, it's always been plays that I've found most pleasurable and perhaps most natural to write. Even though I'm not a playwright, I have written plays for children and again have had that feeling of being in my natural space. But and that was definitely the feeling with I had been almost on the point of abandoning it because I just felt it was a mistaken enterprise. It wasn't working. So it's interesting. So it was just, I suppose, this is how it had to be. And then, in fact, I really kind of enjoyed it because it, as do the illustrations, which I'm sure we'll talk about in a minute, because what Chris Nielsen has done is he's he sets it's scene one, and he very much plays with the whole theatricality of the puppet show. But I like the way that the other world is reflected in a change of prose style as well, that it becomes a play. So that's a sort of a kind of, you're in an artificial environment of some sort, or a created environment, I should say. Whereas I suppose when we're, in prose, we're so used to it that we almost feel we're in reality when we read that. But the children can't feel they're in reality in a way when they're in this sort of, that's a great shot, isn't it? In this sort of thing. So, yeah.
Oh, I must say, as we were going, no, I have to say, I ended up, because I was reading it aloud, there were times where I thought if Poppy was sitting here reading it, it would be quite obvious, like Lara, Pierre. And when I was reading it aloud, I'm going, Lara, still dreaming, what? And so in the end, I started actually making up voices to each of them so that she'd know who was talking.
I was actually about to ask you that. So did you, in the end, you were like all the characters, and did you read the stage directions, or?
Yes.
You did,
so
right.
I would read them in a narrating voice, so that it would set the scene, or so that she would understand what they were about to do or where they were standing compared to another character who just entered. And then, for example, when we're introduced to Mr. Punch, I'm talking about him and I'm going, oh, he doesn't sound very good. And then we'd get to a page with a picture of him. I'd be like, and that's what he looked like. And like, whoa.
He doesn't look too good.
Oh, and I must say, the illustrations are fantastic. They really complemented the words. What was it like working with Christopher on that?
Look, it was fantastic. He's been a graphic artist for many years. He's probably about my age. I shouldn't say that. He's probably at least 10 years younger than me, come to think of it. Poor Chris. But he's not in his 20s. He'd be sort of in his 40s or 50s. And a very, very experienced graphic artist. And he has done a couple of picture books, and I saw one recently. He's just started moving into children's books, and I don't know, it's a sort of intuition thing. You think, wow, what beautiful work, and I guess you feel when you're a writer looking for an illustrator, I guess, obviously I can't draw, but you do need to have some sort of connection of spirit of some sort, that you feel that the person, that you're on some sort of wavelength. I'd only met him very briefly, but the publisher was very excited by the idea of Chris, and he was fantastic. May I say, he was incredibly patient, but he just sort of seemed to understand the whole spirit of it, and it's probably, I don't know, would you say it's probably about 30 or 40% worth of illustrations? As a child, I loved illustrated novels. So I've done another one called Brenda Bella, illustrated by the beautiful and wonderful Andrew Joyner. And that was,
I love his work. I love Andrew's work.
Just beautiful. It was just, so really it was just a great experience. We worked with an editor between us. So the editor was sort of the go-between. So I had very little direct contact with him while we were working on it, which is, I think, from experience, how the publishers prefer to work. And I think it probably is a good idea. But he was so patient, because actually there were a few things that I sort of, for example, this rather lovely opening where you've got the characters with little silhouettes. I found some book from the 1940s, an Italian children's book, and it had sort of silhouettes and characters, and it was almost at the 11th hour. I said to Chris, do you think you could do that? And he just whipped them up like that. Like, he loved it, actually. He was very, I guess, open to however we could try to make the book the best it could be. So, it was great.
Yeah, it sounds like you guys really were on the same page. Yes,
which was great. So, and And which I always am with Andrew as well. I must say, Andrew Joyner. Yeah, he's wonderful to work with too. So it's funny looking back at almost all the books I've done. Not by design, but I do seem to work with men the most in terms of illustrators. So, and I'm not sure what that means, but it's, or whether it's a kind of natural balance or what it is. But yes,
Whatever works.
Whatever works.
Yeah. Now, you have written more than 60 books now, and that's quite an achievement. Did you always know that you were going to be a writer?
Look, I was one of those children that decided to be a writer very early on in the piece. Look, I was actually, interestingly enough, I was a little bit late learning to read. I didn't learn to read till about halfway through year one. And I remember it very well because of that. And interestingly, when I did learn to read, which was my teacher was also very excited, I almost immediately connected it with writing and with the idea of becoming a writer. It was almost this sense that, because even though I couldn't read, I loved books and I loved stories like all children and making up stories, and I loved pretending to read and pretending to write, all those sorts of behaviors that children do. But I do remember that kind of thought, well, now I can write my stories down and I'll be an author. So it was around about the age of 6. And it kind of all happened at once, the reading and the writing and the decision. So obviously, in my life, to earn money, I've done, lots of other things, as all writers have. I mean, now I am more or less a full-time writer, but I never, even when I was doing the other things, there was always just that nugget inside that said, but my real vocation is to be an author, even when I hadn't written anything. So, because as I say to children, I wanted to be an author when I was 6, but I didn't manage to even finish a story till I was 26. 20 whole years, and then they all, look terribly shocked and decide they're not going to be authors. So I shouldn't tell them. But in a sense, in the life of an author, that's
pretty good.
It's not particularly old. So yeah,
absolutely. Because I can tell you at 37, I still haven't finished one. So
that's right. But it's a drive, isn't it? It's sort of just. I even when I wasn't writing anything, I didn't feel, I'm not going to be an author, because it's just some sort of peculiar belief in yourself, I suppose, that you have. I don't know what it is.
I think it's that creative drive, whatever it is, whether it's writing, art, whatever it might be. It's just this creative drive that that that's what you have to do, regardless of what else you're doing. At some point, you will also do that.
Exactly. That describes it perfectly, actually. Yeah.
Excellent. Now, earlier this year, you were announced as the Australian Children's Laureate for 2020-2021. How did that make you feel? And what is your focus for your time as Laureate?
Well, yes, and I should explain to people, in case they just think I'm slightly like pretending I'm a bridesmaid. This is why I'm wearing my laurel wreath, because it helps me get into the role of being a laureate. And that's also why I've got the magpie, because the magpie is the symbol of the laureate. Not quite sure, I'm personally slightly scared of magpies, but they do have such a beautiful voice. And somebody pointed out to me the other day, they're very protective of the young. So, that's a way of looking at it. Look, yes, it was announced in February at the National Library of Australia. We got a ceremony in just before the virus appeared. And I'm the 6th Australian Children's Laureate so far. So there've been 5 predecessors. And what it is you've got the position for 2 years, so it's not for life. And it's a kind of an honour. The laurel wreath is sort of a sign of, honour coming from ancient Greece. But so it's sort of a way of saying, good on you, Ursula, you wrote all those books. And all the Australian Children's Laureates so far have been a writer or an illustrator for children. But it's really a kind of, in New Zealand, they're just going to start having one next year, and they're actually going to call it the Reading Ambassador. And that's a very good description of actually what the role is. It's not just, to say, congratulations, Ursula. It's actually a role whereby for that 2 years, you kind of work out a project, a personal project, and you have a kind of a platform, I suppose, with the aim of celebrating and supporting children's reading. So they had actually told me a few months before that the laurel wreath was coming my way. So I'd had a bit of time to think about it. And as you said at the beginning, I had to sort of think of a project and a slogan. And I went through a few slogans, but the slogan ended up being "Read for Your Life," with the idea that not only that reading is something that might save your life, but reading is something you don't just learn to do it and then put it aside. It's something you do for the rest of your life. And in that sense, the project, which is reflected in there's a sort of Laureate poster and things like that. My personal project, I'm very, very a diehard supporter of public libraries. I'm also, may I say, a diehard supporter of school libraries, but I decided to focus in particular on public libraries and the idea of every child in Australia getting their own library card with their name on it, that they own and that sort of belongs to them and their reading. And so in a sense, with the idea that that the library is a, free resource open to every child, every person in Australia. If you're too far from the library will come to you, where you can get as many books as you like for the rest of your life. And I think with children, as we all know, there's all these books in the library. How can I choose what to read? Well, in a sense, the regular library visiting is how children develop their own taste, follow their own interests. I was talking to some children yesterday at school, and I said, when I was a child, I used to go to the local library every Saturday morning, and I was allowed to borrow 6 books. And I didn't spend a lot of time thinking about which book. It was just a spirit of discovery. I'd just pull them out, take them home. Some of them I didn't like at all. So, and some of them I loved. But it was just this sense that it's a sort of, you learn to love to read. And I think, I learned to read at school, but I learned to love to read in the library with that sort of plenteous sort of access of books. And, the other thing I also say to children is, even though I'm an old lady now, every single book I read makes me a better reader. It's something that never ends. The world of literature is just huge and wonderful, and it's just waiting there for you. So that's my project. It's been a bit stymied you're meant to travel around Australia and tell people your beliefs, hit them on the head with it. Haven't really been able to do that. And also, of course, sort of very sadly, particularly in poor Melbourne and Victoria, a lot of the public libraries have had to be closed. So that's been, I'm sure for everyone involved with libraries, also a painful period, particularly I think in children's lives, which are brief, and children are very unlikely to read books, digital books. That's just sort of not where they're at. When they read, they want to read hardcover books. So that's been tough. But look, hopefully things are getting better, and in terms of library, hopefully we won't have too many more closures. But
we certainly hope not. It's certainly been a sad time, that's for sure. And we've been lucky that a lot of our publishers have allowed us to read our books live on Facebook.
Hasn't that been fantastic?
It has allowed us to just continue helping our community's children be school ready, because so many aren't. And while we're not hitting everyone who would normally come to story time, we're really hoping that in the new year we'll be able to start that again, and being able to allow as many people who want to come to participate in it. So that's something we've really, really missed, is weekly story time.
How wonderful it's been, though, to see all these story times from all over Australia. Like I have watched so many story times with such pleasure. I mean, in a sense, I don't know, but you would also be gathering new audiences as well, wouldn't you?
Certainly have.
Yeah.
And I can tell you, we had some last school holidays that we've never seen an audience like it. We had about 2,000 people watching. And they were from India and Texas and Malaysia, and it was wonderful.
Yeah, inspiration, really. Yeah, look, and I know the libraries have also been, very doughty, and the click and collect, and some libraries have been delivering books, and it's been a tough time, but hopefully we've been luckier, obviously, in Sydney, but there have been significant library closures as well, because obviously they're public places that carry risks. So,
of course.
But,
of course. I must say it's been a really good opportunity for us to get our FrankTALK series happening online as well. So people who'd be working during the day, quite often they're either working from home or whenever it might have been, but by putting these on at lunchtime, it meant they could stop and have a break and catch up with people like yourself and ask questions that they would like to ask you.
Well, I'm very willing to answer them. That's right. FrankTALK. It's very sort of enticing.
Absolutely. Now I have to ask, what role, now that we are able to open again and, life is so much different to what it was 20 years ago, what role do libraries play in 2020? Obviously, we were talking about a lot of things going electronically. How important is that paper in your hand still?
Well, look, and you would know, obviously, because you work in libraries. Look, it's certainly true, well, speaking certainly for New South Wales public libraries, that there has been a uptake, is that the word? The number of digital borrowings has definitely increased, but may I say from a fairly low base. So, you might say we've had 100% more borrowings, but nonetheless, the vast majority of items that get borrowed in public libraries, of the millions of items that are borrowed in public libraries all over Australia, the vast majority are paper and cardboard books. So it's a very interesting, it's almost something for an anthropologist to look at, isn't it? That despite the fact that, it's so much easier, I've got a universe, I've got a library in my pocket every day, and I do use my phone to read when I'm on the bus or at the bus stop. Like, it's obviously it's a wonderful point of access, but nonetheless, most public library borrowing is pleasure reading. Not all, but most. And it would appear when people read for pleasure, children very much included, they want to read paper and cardboard books. I don't know why that is. And it may be that the rupture of the confinement due to the virus will change our habits. But both publishers and libraries it hasn't gone the way, certainly with publishing, it hasn't gone the way that everyone predicted. So that's just a kind of interesting thing about human behavior. The libraries, of course, are also it's a place as well as a resource. It's a place. It's funny sometimes. You think people forget, why do people like going to libraries? They might like going to libraries even if they never look at a book. That there is something in a room that is filled with rows of books that is calming and comforting to the human soul. I think it does have a kind of meaning, the library in itself, that draws people in. And I think people trust libraries and they trust librarians. I think it's a place of community trust. And I think that is sort of pretty inextricably associated with the rows of books, whether it should be or not. But I just think as a psychology that, when you go inside a library, I think you do feel a sense of calmness and trust and a sense of community. So, those sorts of things are available in other places in our society. But I think it's interesting that public libraries, certainly I know in New South Wales, have, I have a brand new local library where I live in Marrickville, and it's absolutely the flagship building of the community. Certainly not the grotty old town hall, we don't necessarily feel a sense of calm and trust when you go in. You might, but, probably sometimes feel a sense of anxiety. But that is not what you feel when you go into the library. And that library is it's only opened last year, but it's just seething with humanity every day. And I think it's the same for children. I think when children go into a children's library, they're going into a space where they can feel it's for them. They feel welcomed. They you know, all the sort of symbolism of the furniture and the colors and the books says to them, we want you here, you belong here, and also says in a very loud voice, reading and books are really important, wonderful things. Not just important, but pleasurable. You know, pleasurable things. Because I suppose that's the thing. It is sadly undeniable that while children in primary school often, for the most part, associate reading with pleasure, whether they read or not, but they would look at that and think, oh, pleasure. As they go into high school, that association of pleasure and reading definitely drops away and they stop reading. And that's very reflected in all sorts of unhappy sort of national testing results of teenagers and their reading ability. And obviously tests are not the be all and end all, but you know, they can't be totally ignored. And I suppose the pleasure in reading, if you want people, to be a good reader, you have to read a lot. You know, that's just how it is. You just have to read a lot. And you will only read a lot if it brings you pleasure. You know, and so I suppose that's why I also want to emphasize that notion of pleasure in reading. And that doesn't just mean fiction like magic puppet shows. You know, as we know, as you would know better than me, that some children find intense pleasure in non-fiction, in discovering the world, in finding out about things, you know, very deep pleasure. And some don't. And that's the wonders of libraries. They've got everything.
Completely agree with you. And I must say, the one thing my librarian friends will not agree with me. I'm not a librarian, and I've taught my daughter to dog ear the pages. So, but we love it. We're lying there and I said, right, and we're up to chapter 8. And she'll go, can I fold the page? So
in a way, that's the physical thing. And look, I remember my own daughter when she was that age, she had books that were completely falling apart because she'd read them so much. And the author, Geoffrey McSkimming, whom I didn't know, but he was in town signing his books. And I said, Maisie, let's go up and get him to sign the books. And I was a little nervous because these books were completely abused, falling to pieces, dog-eared. She probably even underlined things. Do you know what I mean? She loved them so much. But may I say, the author was moved almost to tears. Do you know what I mean?
Because it was loved.
It was so loved. It was just like she couldn't, it was almost like she wanted to eat it, you know, like she just wanted it to be a physical thing as well as the mental thing.
It's funny that you say that because I was talking to a colleague this morning and she said, oh, what have you been reading? Because I had a week off last week and I finished off a lot of books that were on my bedside table, and I've been doing a lot of the audio books because I'm a single mum. So for me, I've got to multitask. If I'm going to read a book, I actually have to multitask. So I was painting a bedroom while listening to a book, and it was wonderful. And I said to her, I've suddenly got this urge to read a book that I first read when I was 10 years old. And it's a Christopher Pike book. And I remember absolutely loving it. And it's called The Midnight Club. And it was about a group of children who were battling cancer. So they were in a hospice. Well, at least that's how I remember it. And I think I've read the book about 3 times, but I haven't read it as an adult. And I said to her, I actually really, really want to read it this coming weekend to see if I pick up a different theme. And just see how I enjoy it. And again, looking at that book, 'cause it's in my bookcase, it is tattered, it is folded back on itself, it is dog-eared, but I love that book and it's my go-to book. And I know, for example, with something like Pierre's Not There, that my daughter absolutely loved it being read to her. Then in a couple of years, she'll pick that up again.
Yes, that's right. Yes. And it's sort of, it can be kind of, it can be almost sort of nerve-wracking to go back to a book that you loved as a child, though, can't it? Because
will I still love it?
So extreme. The response can be so intense, like lots of experiences of childhood. They're just sort of hyper real, and it can be scary almost to feel that, what will I feel when I read it? No, it's I've had both experiences when going back. I've had experiences where that book what good taste I had. That was a work of genius, like that was. And then I've also had, I really love that book.
Well, actually, I thought maybe I'll pick up the friendship themes more than the coming together to tell horror stories.
Right.
Like, I think it was more, that was a scary story they all told. So I'm hoping it's more the friendships. I'll get that other angle.
Yeah.
We'll see. I'll let you know. Now, Rebecca has asked a question. Where do you see the current and future landscape of Australian children's literature? Do you think it will be dominated by the interweaving of current big topical issues and themes of our time, like inclusivity, equality, COVID, political, etc.? And I guess a fusion of that classic storytelling underpinned by contemporary issues. How do you think that's going to look going forward?
It's a very interesting question. And I think the thing is, there's sort of I suppose writers, well, they fall into all sorts of categories. And you have writers, obviously, and, there are several, and there's lots of, may I say, what seem to be very gifted and creative young writers coming up, and illustrators. So there doesn't seem to be any, there's certainly several future generations just sort of marching forward. And I think it depends on the writer. I think you'll have some writers who will express those sorts of things in a very explicit way, and in almost a conscientious way. And then you'll have other writers, which is probably more like me, that the thing is, you're a human being and you live in society. You live in our society. And so the things that are in the air of our society, that are happening in our society, are in your mind, your spirit, your thoughts, in your world. So when you write, your books are contemporary in that sense that a book I would write today is a very different book to what I would have, even if I wrote Pierre's Not There 30 years ago, it would have a different flavor. I couldn't pinpoint where, but there would be a different type of awareness of the world inside you that would be being expressed. So I think, I think you need both kinds of writers, because you have all kinds of readers and there are different moments for different kinds of writing. I don't want that to sound bland, like there's room for everybody type of thing. But I think in children's literature there always has been a strong strand of very kind of explicit attention to how to do good in the world. I think that is, since children's literature began, in fact, it probably had a dominant strain at the beginning, almost instructional literature. And, that has also many varieties and has some great works of art amongst them. And then there's also always been another strand that, is not, you can have a highly escapist strand, but even another strand that may not be explicitly addressing the issues that, was it Rachel? Rebecca was asking. And yet, if you look at it, you sense it. You sense the contemporary world in what's being written. Look, I did some years ago, so I did a PhD in books that were written after, British books. I don't know why I did this. Anyway, too late now. Books that were written, published after and written after World War II in the UK. So in perhaps the first 10 years following World War II. And the theme that I picked on was books that featured miniature people. So an obvious example is The Borrowers. And if you look at The Borrowers' books, so what I started to look at was how these miniature people, in a sense, in a very strong and palpable sense, but not explicit to children, represented refugees and persecuted people, forced to live under the floorboards of other people's houses. And then the housekeeper brings in the exterminator to get rid of the vermin. And then they're forced to flee to another, all those Borrowers books follow a kind of trajectory of persecution and refugees and post-war. And then they finally end out in a model pretend village, which is almost like a sort of, brand new city that they have to kind of create a culture in. So, so that's just an example of books that are not explicitly, and there were also books at that period that were explicitly about child refugees and the consequences of warfare and all of that sort of thing. These books were not at all explicitly that, but if you read them, they're almost terrifyingly explicit if you read them that way. And Mary Norton is the author. I don't know what was in her mind, but I don't believe she could have written those books in the same way at another, in 1935. That sort of issue wouldn't have been in her so explicitly in her head as follow those immediate sort of so I'm sorry, I'm blabbing away here, but that's my. Sorry, Rebecca, that's a sort of very long answer. But in any case, I think there's a lot of writers out there. And whenever I go to schools, I ask the children who wants to be a writer. And if they're 8 years old or under, they all put up their hand. So
either that or a hairdresser.
I haven't asked that. That should be my second question.
I think it would be writer, hairdresser, and cricketer, or Aussie rules if you're in Melbourne. But yeah. Now, Ursula,
like them all.
Yeah, you've won a number of awards for your writing. What is the most special and most rewarding part of being a writer for you?
Look, the awards are beautiful, like exciting, beautiful. They're like something falling out of, a lovely big grapefruit falling out of the tree at your feet. They're just sort of wonderful. And the other thing about awards, of course, is you can't actually expect them. That's what I mean. They're almost like a windfall. Like you can hope for them, and you might think you deserve them, but the vagaries of these sorts of human institutions of picking winning books and so on are so they're so uncontrollable that you just have to, you just have to rejoice when you get them and then just slink away sadly when you don't. So I'm grateful and happy for all my awards and bitterly disappointed at all the times I haven't won awards, which are many more times than I have won awards. But obviously at some level, though, they're important because they kind of create a profile. You're this award-winning author and you've won this award and this award. So that in that sense, for your not only for how other people look at you, but actually for how you feel about yourself. I think they are important. It's hard, that they just sort of are. But you'd be hard pressed to say they're the most important or they're your goal. I think probably everybody here as a writer, it's that, it's the whole thing, you've got a blank page, you start thinking, you start typing, and then you've got a page of creation. I mean, that's the sort of the deepest kind of buzz or whatever it is. And that I think is the thing you can't kind of stop doing. That's why you can't stop doing it. You just get that sort of, may I say, I'm a very slow writer. I do many drafts. I make thousands of errors. It's not all just sort of, I've written a masterpiece, it's a hard slog. I actually once read somewhere, I can't remember who it was, but they said they liked writing the way the boxer likes getting into the boxing ring. A little bit like that. Like, obviously it's what you want to do. It's what brings you the most satisfaction, but, boom, sort of punching you in the face and you're sort of bleeding and crying and all. Yeah, it's not that bad, but you know what I mean? Like it's sort of, so I guess that's, it sounds like a terrible cliche, but I think it is true that it's that sort of act of creation that you get addicted to, perhaps. That's the most rewarding thing.
Oh, we understand that as writers.
Like when a book comes out, but of course it's sort of also a bit unreal, isn't it? It's sort of, and nerve-wracking. It's got a lot of anxiety around it as well. Whereas I think while it's still your private writing, you haven't got that sense of anxiety.
No one's judged it yet.
No, exactly. That's right.
And this one's got a new sticker on it. So
I know. That's the Laureate.
Nice
so
sticker.
Very excited about that. Yeah.
Now, I believe, Ursula, that children, well, anyone, can write with you at the moment via the Australian Children's Laureate Foundation website. And they can also read with you. You've done a series of videos on there as well.
They can. So I've done some reading out loud of story times, and I've also done for every, I'll just grab the calendar to show you what I mean. There it is. So I've got this is also free and downloadable on the website, but there's a Laureate calendar, and I for every month of the year, that's the inside of a happy library done by Andrew Joyner, and that's the outside of a happy children's library done by Toby Riddle. So it's for each year. This year, all the writing activities that come out each month that are free, and they're nicely designed with Andy's drawings, and you can print them out. There's just one page a month of a sort of slightly zany, fun kind of writing activity based on that month. And I'll do, as I said, I'll do the same thing with Toby. So thank you for reminding me. It is a great website. They've done a lot of work on it, and it's got the writing activities, reading activities, and lots of other resources as well. And just one other thing I'd be remiss of me not to mention, it's also, I think you have something equivalent in Victoria, but in New South Wales, the Department of Education has this thing called the New South Wales School Magazine, which is a monthly magazine for school-aged children. It's a literary magazine. And I worked there for a few years. That's when I wrote my plays about 20 years ago. And very beautifully, the magazine decided that they would do a special Laureate edition of the magazine. So this is like the Reader's Digest condensed version of
Lovely.
Because what it is, it's a collection. It's got stuff about the Laureate, but it's also a collection of stories and poems and a play that I wrote when I was working at the magazine, and also a brand new story that I wrote especially for it. So it's a sort of it's a kind of condensed, not condensed because the stories are not condensed, but it's like short stories. So that gives the flavour of my work and the work of the Laureate. So there, and you can find out about that on the Laureate website as well. So that's been, yes, I've got to get to work this holidays and write all the new writing activities for next year. So
now, where can people find you online?
Well, look, I've got a website that is very easy. It's just Ursula Dubosarsky .squarespace.com. But if you put in my name, you don't need to remember the Squarespace. It
does come up.
There's only one Ursula Dubosarsky. That's right. And then the Children's Laureate website, I think, is called children'slaureate.org.au. But again, if you just looked up Australian Children's Laureate, that's where you would find you. It's also on my website, but you would find a lot of those materials I was talking about and more. We're also very much hoping we've designed a special Laureate library card. So the ACT library service is, so it's sort of got a picture of a magpie and some children running around on it, and it's Read for Your Life. And the ACT library service is using that the sort of specially designed library card. It's free for all the children who join the library from now for the next 2 months. So that's also something that we really hope that other libraries around Australia will pick up, because I do think there's something about owning your own reading that's important for children. And I think, having their own library card, even, a library card that really looks like it's for children with this sort of pictures of children on it running around having a good time at the library, and the magpie telling you to join the library. So I think those sorts of things are just really important for that sense of attachment to books and pleasure in books.
I couldn't agree with you more.
Very good.
Well, thank you so much for joining us, Ursula. We have run out of time.
Oh gosh. I'm sorry for all my blabbing. That was
wonderful, absolutely wonderful. So thank you so much. It's been an absolute pleasure chatting with you today.
Well, it's been a total pleasure for me, and thank you everybody who tuned in. Really appreciate the invitation. So happy reading and writing, everybody.
Absolutely. Now, Ursula's books are available to borrow via our Borrow Box app, which you can access for free with your Frankston City Library's membership. Or, of course, you can pick them up from our library branches. We have heaps of Ursula's books. If you're not a member, you can sign up via our website or visit the library. With that membership, you can also access Storybox Library, which features Ursula. Poppy loves when you read your own book. It also has some of your favourite personalities reading your favourite books. My daughter often asks to watch Storybox Library instead of having to listen to me. You can also purchase Pierre's Not There from Robertson's Bookshop in Frankston, and we'll provide a link to their online store when we share this Frank Talk across our social media channels. Keep an eye on the Frankston City Library's website for the great Frank Talks and workshops we have coming up. Thank you so much for joining us for today's Frank Talk with Ursula Dubosarsky for Frankston City Library.